one more time at the story of Ruth. So if you would like to join us in our text today, we're in Ruth chapter 2. We began last week looking at the story of Ruth, specifically taking some background, some context. We learned a little bit about Ruth and where she was from. We learned about the tragedies that marked her life, with the loss of her husband, the loss of her father, the famine that they endured, and how they were returning. She was returning with her mother-in-law, Naomi, back to the land of the Israelite people, and being a foreigner in a strange land at a time when women had very, very little social ability, had very little economic ability. It was a very desperate situation for these two widows to experience. And so last week we got through chapter 2 by just looking at some of the high points, but there were several items in that we had great discussion about that didn't allow us to complete a real good, put a good close to the story of Ruth. So I thought we would go back and loop back to chapter 2. If you'll join me in Ruth chapter 2, we're just going to read through this chapter together, and I'll interrupt us with some comments and questions as we go along. Today specifically, the two topics that I told you last week I wanted to really focus on were this idea of the way that the Israelite people took care of those impoverished and those who were foreigners. And Ruth certainly fit the bill for both. She was a foreigner in a strange land, and she was deeply in poverty. And the way that the society was structured to take care of her was something that God had ordained way back in the very beginning of legislating to His people how they should live, to take care of people just like this for situations just like this. And the other thing I said we were going to talk about is this idea of what was called a kinsman redeemer, which is a highly technical kind of idea, but something that has a beautiful sentiment behind it, and certainly in the life of Ruth played a very important role. So Ruth chapter 2, if you'd like to follow along. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side. He was a prominent man of noble character from Elimelech's family, and his name was Boaz. Ruth, the Moabitess, asked Naomi, "Will you let me go into the fields and gather fallen grain behind someone with whom I find favor?" Let's stop there for a second. With the story of Ruth, the thing that we keep going back to is this incredible relationship that Ruth and Naomi have. A daughter-mother-in-law relationship that is of incredible closeness and depth. And here we have this sense of courtesy, this sense of etiquette. Ruth is so respectful of her mother-in-law that she asks if she can go and do this. This was something that Israelite law afforded her. She didn't necessarily need permission from anybody, let alone her mother-in-law, to go and take care of these needs. But there's something very special about this. She goes to her mother-in-law and she goes through the steps of saying, "This is what I would like to do. This is something I see as a possibility. I recognize the need that we have. We don't have any food. This is a way that I can go and get food. Do I have your permission to do that?" I think this just reflects one more time on the beauty of Ruth's character as a person and the beauty of the relationship that these two had together. Naomi answered her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So Ruth left and entered the field to gather grain behind the harvesters. She happened to be in the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was from Elimelech's family. Later, when Boaz arrived from Bethlehem, he said to the harvesters, "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they replied. And Boaz asked his servant who was in charge of the harvesters, "Whose young woman is this?" A couple of things in this that is very interesting to me. One of them is that at the beginning of this section, we have this statement. Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, Elimelech's family, named Boaz. And then you just kind of look at that like, why is that stuck up there? It doesn't have anything to do with the storyline. In the end of chapter 1, you have Naomi and Ruth are coming back to Bethlehem. And then in verse 2, Ruth goes out to harvest in the fields. But in verse 1, you just have this thing that's kind of stuck there. And when you're first reading it, you're like, well, what does that have to do with anything? But it's not until you get later in the story that you see, oh, There's a reason that Boaz is introduced here, because that's the field that she went to harvest in. What's curious to me is there's nothing here in the text that says she was directed to go to that field necessarily. There's nothing here that says Naomi said, yes, you can go glean. And not only that, here's the field I want you to go to. I am not a believer in a lot of chance. I'm not a person who puts a lot of credence in luck and coincidence. I am a person who puts a lot of credence in providence. And I believe very much that when we read the pages of Scripture, and I'll just say, when we're living the days of our lives, incidents and occurrences that we might very well chalk up to coincidence were probably more likely to be attributed to providence, God at work in our lives. I think that's what we see here. I think God is directly working in the life of Ruth. Out of all the fields she could have chosen, you know, it's like the old Humphrey Bogart movie, out of all the gin joints, out of all the fields, it's like 3 people in here that saw that movie, but out of all the fields that she could have gone to, how lucky is it that she just happened to fall into that field? Well, I don't think it's luck. I think this is another example of God at work, God moving in the fabric of this story to put Ruth in the place where she needs to be. Let's look at something else. Verse 4. When Boaz arrived from Bethlehem, he said to the harvesters, "The Lord be with you." Boaz is a wealthy guy. Boaz has many fields spread out all across the region, and Boaz comes to check in on his harvesters. I don't know how you all feel at your place of employment, at your work, when the boss shows up, but your boss may not show up the way he did. I don't get the sense here that Boaz is coming in with his notepad and his spreadsheet, and he's all about business. The first thing he says to him is not, "How much have you gotten done? Where are we? What's the problem?" First thing he says to him is, "The Lord be with you." That says to me Boaz had a personal connection with his workers. Boaz was a person who had an understanding that these people were not merely cogs in some kind of a wheel that spun money out into his bank account. These are people. These are people, and he cared for them. He was interested in them. "The Lord be with you," he said. And then look at the way they respond to him. "And the Lord bless you." I don't think that that's just a statement of, "How you doing? Fine." I think that's a genuine, legitimate statement that the workers are making. I think these are workers who look at this guy and say, he genuinely has interest in us. And we genuinely are affectionate towards that. We're well disposed to that. Yeah, Roger.
The other thing I picked up here, they weren't as close as you and I are, because it says they yelled back.
Yeah. There's a distance there. You can see the picture of Boaz coming to the edge of the field and calling out, and them looking up from the work and calling back, and that's.
Which meant that they weren't ashamed to say that out loud.
Yeah. There's a sense of familial and excitement that, oh, look, he's here. Yeah. And there's something special to that. I think that says a lot about Boaz's character. And the reason that I think this is truly the demonstration of Boaz's heart towards his workers is what we just read in the next verse. In verse 5, Boaz, who has many fields, who has many workers, he is looking out across this field, and he identifies there's somebody in this field that I don't know. There's somebody in this field that I don't know. If you are in a situation at your business where there are many, many people under you in terms of your responsibility to them, I hope you do know them. I hope you know them by face. I hope you know them by name. I hope that when there is somebody not in that number, you would be able to recognize it. But the reality is a lot of people don't. A lot of people don't have supervisors, managers above them who get to know them so well that they immediately go, "Hey, wait, that's not somebody I know. Who is that person?" There's an interest. There's a sense of, I don't know who that is, and I want to know. And it's not like who's that person in my field? Because his next question, or not his next question, but the next conversation, pick it up in verse 6. "She is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the territory of Moab. She asked us, 'Will you let me gather fallen grain among the bundles behind the harvesters?' She came, and she has been on her feet since early this morning, except that she rested a little in the shelter." 2 things here. She's a hard worker. She's a hard worker. She goes out and she gets after it. And that's something that even the workers in the field have to recognize. They say, yeah, we know the girl you're talking about, and man, she is a locomotive. She is out there working and working and working. The other thing, she's courteous. Remember at the beginning how she said, Naomi, can I go do this? When she did arrive at the field, look, the first thing she did, she went to the workers and said, is it okay for me to do this? By law, it's her right. She doesn't have to ask. That is something that is guaranteed by law. But she has a courtesy about her to say, I know that I'm afforded this right, but I want to make sure that it's okay with you. I really want to make sure that this is all right. I know I'm just beating this stuff to death. But I think that this is really important because these are the kind of little details that when we read through the story, we might miss. And these are all little bullet points that are saying, she's a good person. She's a kind person. She's a compassionate person. She's a loyal person. She's a dedicated. They're building the skeleton of her character. And I think that it's important, if the author of this book spent so much time putting these details in, there's a reason for it. And it's so that we can understand the character. My goodness, I'm taking so long in this. We're not, all right. This is why this is 2 weeks, because I do this. Verse 8, then Boaz said to Ruth, listen, my daughter, don't go gather grain in any other field. Don't leave this one, but stay here close to my female servants. See which field they're harvesting and follow them. I've ordered the young men not to touch you. When you're thirsty, go drink from the jars the young men have filled. She fell face down, bowed to the ground, and said, why have I found favor with you, so that you notice me, though I am a foreigner? We'll get to the why in just a moment. But let's look at a couple of things. Boaz goes so above and beyond. The law says if somebody is hungry, you have to let them come around the edges of your field and pick up the grain that drops and pick up the grain that you don't pluck. That's the law. He goes so far beyond that. He's like, you stay right behind my workers. He said, when you're thirsty, you drink out of my water pots. He said, I've talked to my boys, and they are not going to give you grief. I hate that we even have to have this conversation, but he wouldn't have said that if there hadn't been a concern there. The reality is, that is the scenario. That gives us an insight to how incredibly vulnerable a person she personally was in this moment. She didn't even have the safety of going out in the fields to glean from the droppings on the ground without a thought in her head, I might get taken advantage of. This is a vulnerable position. And he said, I want you to know your physical needs are taken care of, your safety is taken, and I don't want to get all like, mail roll stuff. But there is a very clear admonition in the Bible that among the things God created men to do is to provide and protect. And Boaz here is stepping into his masculine mandate. He's stepping into what it is that God instructed men to be. Provide and protect. And he said, I know you're going to get thirsty. I've got water. I know you're going to feel unsafe. I've got protection. You're in a good spot. You can feel safe. And again, not to get too far down the road, but I think one of the great needs of the beautiful feminine character is to feel safe. And I think God created men to provide a place where that could be. You notice I'm saying all these things while my wife is not in the room. And we're gonna lose that video because this isn't going to be watched later. Where was I? Oh, verse 11. She said, why in the world would you do all this? I'm a nobody. I'm worse than a nobody. I'm a foreigner. I don't belong here. This isn't my place. Why in the world would you give me so much favor? Verse 11, Boaz answered her, everything you have done for your mother-in-law since your husband's death has been fully reported to me. How you left your father and mother and your native land and how you came to a people you didn't previously know. May the Lord reward you for what you have done, and may you receive a full reward from the Lord, God of Israel, under whose wings you've come for refuge. That's powerful. He said, I know all about you. I know all about you. And not only do I know all about you, I have such admiration for what you've done. Your good deed has not gone unnoticed. Your bravery, your courage, your loyalty is something that I have seen and I stand in awe of. I have respect for. This is an amazing display of character. This is a person who has up to this point never had a conversation with Ruth and yet says, I know all about you. I'm not going to go too far down this road. You meet somebody out in the community and they say, oh, I know all about you. Does that bring trepidation or does that bring anticipation? Somebody stops you and says, I know all about you. Do you immediately think, oh, that may not be good? Or do you immediately think, bring it? What do you know? I have no concern, no fear. I think that that's a good reminder for us. They're always watching. The world is always watching. The world is always seeing and drawing conclusions and sharing with each other about our character. We just last week in our sermon talked about what it means to live a witness. The Holy Spirit lives within us to help us live a witness. And that is us going out into the world and demonstrating the truth of the gospel by how we act and how we live and how we speak and how we think and how we function in society. That is an incredible witness to the world. There's an old saying that your life is the only sermon that some people may ever hear. Old preacher that I used to work with many years ago used to sing this little silly song with the kids, and he would sing, Christian, don't you know that you're a sermon in shoes? Everywhere you go, you're preaching, you're proclaiming, you're sharing. What is it that the world is knowing about you? What is it that is being shared about you? When it came to Ruth, Boaz said, I know everything about you, and I have such respect for it. He was a caring person. He was an empathetic person. Yeah, please, Tim. Yep. Yeah.
All these things, it's like, cool, God has taken such all of us.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just very, very cool. And I get a sense of what she must have felt.
Yeah. Yeah. If you couldn't hear his comment, let me just try to summarize it quickly because it was beautifully said. There's so many times when we see the mass of humanity, the faceless crowds. A lot of us watched a football game on Monday, and as you scan that, those far shots of the stands, you don't see people. You just see, you see people, but you don't see a person. You don't see them. And that really can be the way that, we often see. It's just all of them. And how that must be to God. But that's not the way God sees us. God sees each and every one of us. He made the point that, God knows the number of hairs on our head. Easier for Josh and I than some of you. But for most of He knows us that well. He knows each and every person. We are not faces in a crowd to Him. And Boaz was very Christ-like in that regard here. Boaz didn't see a sea of workers. He identified one person, he zoned in, and he got real close. We did a sermon series back in April, May last year, based on the book The One, and how Jesus, was able to see one person and really focus on one person. And that's exactly what Boaz did. He had that same kind of mindset that Christ had, to really see one person. Great point. Any other thoughts on that? I tend to be rolling here. All right. Let's roll. I'm going to summarize this last part so we don't read through the entire rest of the chapter. But the niceties, the favor, the provision, the care just continues to go. Lunchtime comes and they ding, ding, ring the dinner bell, and the workers come in to eat, which, by the way, incidentally, that wasn't necessary. That wasn't something that was like a legal rule that the farmer had to provide lunch for his workers. That was something Boaz did. That was Boaz's practice. Boaz called all the workers in, had a meal prepared, and set it out before them. Just goes again to show the kind of boss he was, the kind of person he was, the kind of character he possessed. And you can almost get the picture, like all the workers are coming in, and Ruth's kind of like, I'm going to just stay low and get out of the way. And she, you can almost just see him like, hey, get in here. We're eating. Come join us. Come sit down. Come sit right here. Come here. Have some. And he just includes her. He just brings her in. And then she got up and she headed out. And Boaz is like, hey guys, come here, come here. Look, here's what I want you to do. When you go out there, intentionally be bad at your job. Go be intentionally bad at your job. Pull some of the grain out and just kind of drop it on the ground. When you pulled all the bundles together in those big sheaves, just grab a handful of it and just throw it back out here so that she doesn't have to work hard to pick it up. She can just come literally walk right behind you and just pick it right up. He basically said, you be really bad at your job so that she can have a really easy job. She gathered up 26 quarts of barley that day. I'm not sure how much a quart of barley is. I'm not sure how much a quart is. I'm not sure what barley is. But she picked up a whole bunch, and she was really impressed by that, and that was something that her mother-in-law, when she came back, was just like, how in the world did you do this? This is remarkable. This is potentially a couple days' worth of grain to keep us alive. What a great thing. And then in verse 20, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may the Lord bless him, speaking of Boaz, because he has not abandoned his kindness to the living or to the dead. Naomi continued, this man is a close relative. He's one of our family redeemers. Ruth the Moabitess said, he also told me, stay with the young men until they have finished their harvest. So Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, my daughter, it is good for you to work with his female servants, so nothing will happen to you in another field. And Ruth stayed close to Boaz's female servants and gathered grain until the barley and the wheat harvests were finished. And she continued to live with her mother-in-law. Boaz said, I'm going to take care of you today, and I'm going to take care of you through this entire harvest season. Not just the barley harvest. When the barley harvest is done, you come back and we're going to do the wheat, and I'll take care of you through that too. Just provision on top of provision. Protection on top of protection. Naomi identifies it. Naomi says, this is a great kindness. He is showing kindness to us. He's showing kindness to our family, Elimelech, who is dead. And you need to stay with him, and so she does. She does that. I said last week that I wanted to touch on one more thing about the gleaning. We talked last week about the process of gleaning was the law in the Israelite law code that when you went through to pick your grain, you got like one shot at it. You know, you go, you grab it, you pluck it. If it doesn't come off, you leave it. Because that means that that's there for somebody else to come by later and pick it up. The outer, I don't remember how many it is. There's a certain number of outer rows that you just leave so that people that are walking along the road can just, you know, get a little to go. That was the drive-through before the days of drive-through. These things were already provided for them. Rob? It's a little bit, 26 quarts is a little over a bushel? Okay. If a little over a bushel. So for those of you that know what barley is or a quart, now you're even more informed by knowing that it was about a bushel. Since I don't know what a bushel is either, that much. Okay, there we go. Now, see, Rob, if the Bible just said this much, I'd be like, oh, I totally get that. That they need pictures. They needed somebody to do a drawing to say about this much, and I'd be like, man, that's a haul. That's a great haul. Thank you. That's good insight. I did not know that. Provision took care because of the gleaning. Two things specifically about this idea of the gleaning that I went back and looked at this week, and I just want to go back to where that law was instituted. In the book of Leviticus chapter 19 verse 9, this isn't actually when it was originally instituted, this is when it was revisited, but this is the law. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. That specifically is the stuff that you pluck but it falls and you go back and pick it up off the ground. You get one shot. If you didn't get it, leave it. If you drop it, leave it. That's for somebody to come along. Why? Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. And then he says, because I am the Lord your God. He ties it to his deity. He ties it to who he is. God says, this is how I want you to act because of who I am. Now, I don't want to get too far down that road, but that is a deep, there's a lot of theology up in there. You act the way you do because of who I am. And that is the theme that is connecting all the old laws, and now in the new covenant, that's the very basis for the new covenant. Why are we expected to act and behave and do the way we act and behave and do? Because of who he is. That's why. That's why it's so important. Yes, Reba.
Earlier in the story, Ruth said, your God will be my God.
Yeah.
And so she chose Ruth's God, or Naomi's God. And she literally puts herself in slavery because that's what she did. She put herself into a position,
Yeah.
such a low position where she was lucky to get the leftovers.
Yeah.
The special people, you know what I mean?
Yep.
People were being the ones who got the leftovers and everything. And so I can't help but think that God, when she turned herself over like that God, there's something I've been seeing lately. It says, stand back and see the great work I'm ready to do before you.
Hmm.
And I think that God provided all of that and made everything work so that he could reward her for her decision
Yeah.
to put herself in his hands.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better. On that fateful moment, when Ruth looked into Naomi's eyes and said, where you go, I go. Where you live, I live. Where you die, I die. Your people are my people, and your God will be my God. She absolutely embraced every aspect of that, but especially when it came to your God will be my God. She just devoted herself to that, and she's a beautiful example of how when somebody does commit themselves to the care of God and love of God, that it is reciprocated. God takes care of that, and God honors that. The last thing I'll say about this is in Leviticus 19, that passage I just read to you, the poor and the foreigner. I recognize, and we're not going to go down this road any further than just to say this, I recognize that we're in a politically interesting time. And I know that these two issues are things that continue to hit the headlines. The foreigner and the poor. The foreigner and the poor. How do we deal with those two? And all I will say in this, and this is the cap, we're moving on, is just simply, we need to step outside of partisan politics and what's being spoken in the government. And we need to really ask ourselves, what is the mandate of God? Because at the end of this, he said, you take care of the poor and you take care of the foreigner because I am God. Not because I am this party or that party, because I follow this person or that person, but because of who you are in your relationship with God. Let that be the way you look at the world. And so I think it's a reminder that we need to step outside of political lenses. We need to see the world the way God sees the world and move into it. The other thing that I said I wanted to talk about is this idea of the Goel. The Goel. The kinsman redeemer. It's a really odd concept. It's something that's a little bit hard for us to get our mind around. But this person who is a kinsman redeemer. Go back to chapter 2, verse 1. Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, okay? We have a family connection. He was a prominent man. He was wealthy. He had noble character, and he was from Elimelech's family, and his name was Boaz. So we have a man here who has some certain qualities. He's wealthy, he's well thought of, and he is a family member. This person, verse 20 of chapter 2, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may the Lord bless him, Boaz, because he has not abandoned his kindness to the living or the dead. Naomi continued, this man is a close relative. He is one of our family redeemers. Some translations will say kinsman redeemers. That word that means family redeemer is a Hebrew word, goel. Goel. And what it literally means, what does it literally mean? Where did I write that? You ought to find your notes before you say things. Oh, here it is. Goel means literally the one who delivers or the one who rescues. That's what this is. It is a person who delivers or rescues. In the Bible, there's typically 3 different times that you hear about a kinsman redeemer. And what it is a person who is a family member and they act on behalf of another family member who's in need. The most common way this is used, and this is mentioned in Leviticus chapter 25, is if a family member has to sell property in order to survive. So I am so poor that I can't put food on the table. And let's say it's not a season of harvest, so my fields are not doing me any good. And I look around and I go, I'm going to watch my kids die, and I'm going to hold on to a field that at this moment is not producing anything, or I can sell that field and I can feed my family for at least another while. And so I do that. And now I'm penniless. Now I don't have a field, and we're running out of food again. A family member could step in and could buy that field on my behalf. Now, normally, when I go and buy a field, I keep pointing like there's a field there. That's a house, but I pretend there's a field there that I'm pointing at in some dramatic way that's getting a point across. I go and I buy this field. Typically, my name would be on the deed, right? I own that field. But in this case, what happens is I pay the money, but it goes back into the ownership of that family member who lost it, who had to sell it. That's this idea. I buy it, but it's not for me. I buy it and I give it back to the family. So now he can go back to work, he can farm his field, and so that's a redeeming property is the most common way this works. A second way this works, Deuteronomy 25 talks about this, and this is if a man died and he didn't have a son. Let's say he has property and he has, but he doesn't have a son and he dies. Well, that property then becomes a big point of contention, because back then it was very, very specific. Whatever you had went to the firstborn son. And if you didn't have a firstborn son, there's all kinds of problems. So what could happen is that a brother or a close male relative could marry that widow and could have a kid. That kid would be the inheritor of his not his dad's, but his wife's first husband's property. That would be his property. Now, if I'm the one that marries that woman and I father that child, I don't get any connection to him. He doesn't get my property. That property or his inheritance is from that side of the family. Am I saying that clearly? I don't think I'm that, okay. I feel like I'm talking in a big circle. I listen to that. This is just straight up like, well, it's kind of like Wild Wild West stuff. It kind of makes me think of like, Wild West law. Basically what this meant was that if a family member of mine was being abused, was being hurt, or had gotten killed, that I could declare kinsman redeemer status and basically go in and get revenge. I could go in and I could avenge that harm or avenge that death. It was vigilante justice. It seems that was kind of frowned upon. It's one of those things where the people kind of allowed it, but they all kind of knew, like, this probably isn't right. This probably isn't a good thing. But this was a way that they did this, is that it was avenging a harm. So you could claim kinsman redeemer status, or you could appeal to somebody. And I could say, hey, I'm getting beat up by all these bullies, and I got a big uncle, and I could say, hey, can you be my kinsman redeemer? Come in here and beat up all these bullies for me. And that could be one way that played out. Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Like all someone's possessions go to, let's say someone remarries.
Yeah.
And they have children from another marriage. And rightfully, their belongings should be to those children. But in today's world, their possessions go to that married person, that second person, and the children get nothing.
Yeah.
And so that was God's way of providing for them.
It was. That's right. Yeah, yeah. It's a sad reality. You know what? I mean, it's just a sad reality when you think about the fact that we're such terrible, terrible people. But we do that. That's not new. But the problems that come with inheritance. Anybody that's ever had any kind of a kerfuffle about some inheritance claim, it's heartbreaking. It's terrible. It's tragic. We've had it in our own family. My family's been through it, and it's a wildly difficult thing, and people are just so prone to take advantage. And I think you're absolutely right. I think this is God trying to make provision. He's saying, look, I know how bad you guys are going to mess this stuff up. I know how you're going to take advantage of each other. I know how you're going to try to steal and cheat each other out. So I'm going to provide these means where a person can be can have a level of protection, have a level of care given to them. And so there's a sense in there that I think that's exactly what God was creating this process to do. Now, I've already said, people took it and twisted it. People took it and abused it. And this isn't the first thing that they've done. This isn't the first time that God has tried to do something kind for us that we've messed it up. In fact, I tell my kids all the time, I believe that most of the sins that we commit in the world are actually, by nature, sins that are based around a good gift misused. That's generally what I find most of the sins that we commit. It's something God gave us as a good thing, and we've said, oh, I know how I can use this in a bad way, and we get all messed up with it. And so I think that God came in and He said, I want this kinsman redeemer thing to be there for your protection. I want it to be there to provide, stability. I want it to be there so that you can take care of each other. And they kind of twisted it and did some bad things with it. But at its core, I think it was a really beautiful thing. So Boaz here is introduced to us as the kinsman redeemer. There's this beautiful process at the end, and if you haven't read it, I really encourage you to go and read chapter 3, read chapter 4, because there's just this wonderful exchange of how it is that Boaz goes about this. Boom, right here you can already see the kindness, the sincere interest that Boaz has for Ruth. Ruth immediately picks up on this and immediately finds this to be an enormously attractive quality, as I think any woman would find an incredibly attractive quality in a man that is so caring and so empathetic and so careful and protective and loving and kind. And so she very quickly develops feelings for him, and so her mother-in-law helps set her up with Boaz. And I won't get into all the details of how this worked out, but it involved a threshing floor and a late night rendezvous. And I tend to believe that what we have here is a very innocent and very sweet gesture. Some people have taken it to mean much other things, but she makes clear to Boaz, this is my intention. I would love to spend my life with you. If that's something you have interest in. He reciprocates, and so he wants to marry her. But for him to marry her, there is another relative that's closer. And so this other relative kind of has the right of first refusal. And Boaz, being a very, very meticulous person, a very courteous person, he recognizes this. And so he goes to this other relative and he goes, hey, I really got a thing for Ruth, and I'd like to, pursue that, but you're kind of the next one in line. And so am I cool? It's kind of like in high school when you got two buddies and they both see the same girl and the dibs. You can't. That doesn't work. It worked for me, by the way. I dibbed on Bill, and here Sue and I are 36 years later. So it worked at least once. So basically he says, look, I know you get right of first refusal, and he thinks about it, and it says in here, you'll read it when you go back and look at it. It says he realized that if he did have a kid with her, it wouldn't be in his line, and he didn't want that. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. But it says something. It says something. Boaz knew exactly what he was doing. If I have a kid with Ruth, that is Elimelech's line, not mine. And I'm here to help Ruth. I'm here because of my love for Ruth. This other guy was like, that really doesn't offer me anything, so I'll pass on that. And then to make it, boy, I wish we had time to get into this because this is fun. So to make the proclamation, these two guys go through this really fun ceremony, which I think we ought to reinstitute today. It would be so cool. They go to the ceremony where they come to the leaders of the village who all get together in the front of the village. To me, it's like McDonald's, the little group of old guys that go to like McDonald's every morning. That's kind of what I think about the village leaders. They just would come out and sit at the village gate and just be like, who's going to bring us business today? And up walks Boaz and this other guy whose name I don't remember if it's even in there. And say that again?
The note I have is that man's name was not recorded.
Oh.
Scandalous.
Yeah. Yeah.
Didn't even want his name.
Didn't even want it remembered. Yeah. Oh, okay. Good. Look at there. That's a good note. That's a good note, Jason. I didn't catch that. That's great. So these two guys go up to the leaders of the city, and Boaz says, hey, you know, this new chick in town, Ruth, and I'd really like to make her my wife, but he can say no, and he says, no, I don't want her. And Boaz says, well, I do want her. And they say, okay, you know, do the thing. And so they like take off their shoes and exchange shoes and stuff. It's like this really weird contract. That's the way they did contracts, is like swap shoes. I'm like, that would be hilarious. Could you imagine when you go to the title office and you sold a car and she's like, okay, let's see him swapping the shoes. And so that's kind of what they did. There's a lot to that we won't get into because I've got 3 minutes left in class. So they do that. And Boaz then goes and has a wonderful life with Ruth. Let's skip over to chapter 4. Verse 11, all the people who were in the city gates, including the elders, said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is entering your house like Rachel and Leah. That means may you have lots and lots of happy children who together build the house of Israel. Maybe you be powerful in Ephrath, which is another name for the region around Bethlehem. May your name be well known in Bethlehem. That's the city they were living in. May your house be like the house of Perez, the son of Tamar, who bore Judah. That's their family lineage. And because of the offspring of the Lord will give you by this young woman. And Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. He slept with her, and the Lord granted conception to her. And she gave birth to a son. And the women said to Naomi, listen, the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not left you without a family redeemer. May his name be well known in Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. Your daughter-in-law who loves you is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Naomi took the child, placed him on her lap, and became his nanny. And the neighbor women said, a son has been born to Naomi. Well, it wasn't Naomi's kid. It wasn't, well, it kind of was, because that was that family line. And so that was continuing that family line. And also, we don't have to get all that nitpicky, right? I've got grandkids, and those are my kids, and I say all the time, this is my Noe, this is my Celeste. We don't have to get all nitpicky. But the reason, though, that they said, God has given you a son is because that's the son that's going to carry on the family inheritance and is going to continue, the family farm and all that stuff that's been lost. But the point that I wanted to make here is the happiness that they had together. Boaz and Ruth go on to have a beautiful love story. They go on to have fruitful. They go on to have a beautiful lineage that includes some very, very important people like King David. King David's going to come from that line. In fact, if you look at verse 22, Obed fathered Jesse, Jesse fathered David. One of the most important, my very favorite Bible character in the whole Old Testament, came from this marriage. This marriage, sent us down the path of having the great King David. And David was not even near the most prominent person in that family line. Because if you know anything at all about the lineage, you know that from the line of David came Jesus Christ. And so Jesus Christ traces lineage back to a kinsman redeemer. I've got exactly 1.5 minutes. Let me tell you one thing about this kinsman redeemer that I want to wrap it all with. And here it goes. Ruth and Boaz have a family. That family includes King David. That family includes the king himself, Jesus Christ. And it all started with a kinsman redeemer. It all started with a kinsman redeemer. A kinsman redeemer can come in and can avenge an injustice. Boaz did that. He didn't do it in a violent way, but he did that. He fixed a family problem. And injustice was being poured out on Ruth, in that she was helpless and hopeless and had no inheritance, had no home, had no crops, had no fields. And he fixed that. Levirate marriage. He stepped in and he brought about a family where she had no family. And redeeming property. He bought back at his cost. He paid for something that he didn't get the benefit from, but that he paid the cost so that she could have the benefit. Her family could have the benefit. And they together had Jesus. Jesus is called a kinsman redeemer. And if you look at those different things, you can see why. Because Jesus came to remove injustice. Jesus came to set straight the scales of justice. We read that all over the place when it's talking about prophecies of what Jesus will come and do. He's going to bring justice. He's going to bring fairness. He's going to bring equity. He's going to take those things that have been unfair and He's going to make them fair. He's going to change our world. And I don't care. I don't care if you don't believe one iota about Jesus Christ. You absolutely cannot be a student of history. Look at the world we live in today. Look at the world before Christ and say He didn't impact it. He absolutely did. He has changed our society in such incredible ways. Even if you do not believe in Him at all, you cannot deny the impact He's had in what He's brought about in justice. He brought about a restored inheritance, that redeeming property idea. Ruth had no means to carry on. She had no means of a family. She had no connection. She had no community ties. She had no heir. She had no family. She had no structure around her. And Boaz brought that to her, and Jesus brings that to us. We who were not a people are now a people, the Bible says. We are a community where we once weren't. I don't know any of you all that I would necessarily know if it weren't for Jesus. I don't know how we would have any relationship together. Some of them I hope we would, but I mean, if there's not a Jesus, I don't even know how we would ever form any kind of community. We have a community that we couldn't have had except for the kinsman redeemer. And the idea of paying a cost and not receiving the benefit. Paying a cost on behalf of somebody else. I'm going to buy this field, but I'm not going to get benefit from this field. I'm paying the price, but you get the benefit. And that's exactly what we see in Jesus. We see Jesus who comes and says, you have a price you can't pay, and I'll pay it. Slate clean. And it's a beautiful, beautiful picture. He got no benefit from that, in any way that we can understand. And He paid a price, that we couldn't pay. And so I think this idea of the kinsman redeemers are really cool. We call that technically a type, antitype, or a foreshadowing. But I think that the most important thing is just to be able to look at it and go, oh, I can see Jesus in that. I can see Jesus in that. One of our overarching themes in this class has been, when we look at stories in the Old Testament, can we see Jesus in those stories? And I think Boaz is a beautiful story. Kinsman redeemer of exactly what Jesus was. Thanks for your comments today. Appreciate it very much. We'll try to get back on schedule.